So, welcome folks to the first of our monthly webinars for 2018-19. Would you believe we are already in a new school year that has rocketed by. Today's session we're going to look at teachers' pay in light of the new school teachers' pay terms and conditions document. And as ever, I'm Summer Mesa, and also my partner in crime, Liz Mayhew.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be with you again for a new school year.
Yeah. So those of you who are regular visitors to our webinar Wednesdays, you'll be familiar with the webinar toolbar. So do make use of the chat feature as we go through the session, and feel free to share questions with us. And also on the webinar toolbar feature there, you'll see a section called materials. We've got a number of resources in there for you, particular to this session, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that we're about to go through and talk to you about, and also a checklist for making pay decisions as you look to make decisions around your pay award for this year. So do feel free to download those documents during the course of the presentation using that feature there within the webinar toolbar. There's quite a bit that we have got to cover with you today in the time that we have available. Our usual 2 p.m. slot running through till 3. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover. So we're going to look at where are we now in terms of the current landscape for teachers' pay, the various sort of provisions attached to that, the current sort of policy position. We're going to look at what is the pay award for this year, so the 2018 School Teachers' Pay Terms and Conditions document. Obviously there was some news items and press releases around that ahead of the summer, but it was quite close to the holidays, so not everyone will have seen that, I'm sure. We'll look to make sense of those press releases and give you some additional information besides. One of which we will talk to you a little bit about funding considerations. We know that the government are intending to offer some funding for the pay award for this year and into next, but there are some key questions as we await the detail of what that looks like that you'll be wanting to ask yourselves to help you in making decisions that are right for you, not just for now, but also future focused, thinking 3 and 5 years hence in terms of your financial planning cycle. We'll also look at, I suppose, specifically what that means for your school and how you should go about determining pay progression this year, or certainly some advice and guidelines, things for you to think about as you make those determinations. We'll give you a bit of a steer on the LA and, of course, the union view. And give you a bit of an inside scoop on that. We'll also look at what changes do you need to make to your pay policy for 2018-19 in relation to the Teachers' Pay Terms and Conditions document. We'll also look at how you can approach specific circumstances such as maternity leave, sickness absence, that can happen during the course of an appraisal and pay cycle, and how best to manage those, how you might want to manage those. We'll also look at those instances where pay progression may need to be declined owing to less than expected, less than required performance, and we'll also look at considerations if you're looking at alternative approaches to pay, and we'll give share some thoughts and advice around that as well. So as ever, we promise you a jam-packed agenda, and it's probably as well that we look to get it out. So where are we now?
Yes, so we thought it would be helpful to start this afternoon with a bit of a recap for you on the current landscape in terms of teachers' pay and the key provisions that schools have been working with now since 2013 and 2014 with regards to pay. If you're around this time, you might remember that point saw quite a significant shift in the landscape in terms of how teachers' pay is managed for schools locally to exercise local discretions and far more flexibility with regards to how they pay their teachers and how they make pay determinations. So on the slide there, we've captured kind of, I guess, what the key elements are currently of the pay landscape for teachers. First and foremost is that schools have the discretion to determine annually a pay framework that's right for them in their school. Nationally, the DfE publish minimums and maximums to each of the teaching pay scales, but what happens within that is for you as a school to determine locally in accordance with your pay policy. So there's scope there for many different variations and permutations in terms of how teachers are paid. Likewise, year on year, schools have discretion to determine precisely how much is given to each teacher in pay progression when a teacher is meeting the performance expectations. And again, we're seeing an increasing variety of ways in which those pay awards are determined and decided upon. In terms of actual criteria for pay progression, there's really very minimal guidance in the SDPCD now about what criteria warrant pay progression, and it's for you as a school to determine locally within your pay policy really the criteria and the expectations you have of your teachers in terms of what they need to be achieving for you to warrant pay progression. And certainly over the last year, we've worked with a number of schools who are really looking at that in more detail and looking to establish what's right for them in terms of what good performance looks like. Other flexibilities that have been in place for a few years now relate to starting salaries. So when a teacher joins you from another school, there's no obligation to match the salary that they might have been paid in a previous school. So again, that gives you far more flexibility to offer salaries that are commensurate with the accountabilities of the post, rather than salaries that you've inherited from another school. In terms of threshold, a teacher can apply for the threshold or the upper pay scale at any point in their teaching career. So potentially a teacher in year one of their teaching career, if they felt they met the expectations to move on to that higher pay range, they could make an application to do that. And I think that's had implications for schools in terms of maybe those moves to the higher pay range coming about earlier than maybe they would have done previously, where people had to reach the ceiling of the main pay range before they progressed. And then looking at leadership, there are now greater flexibilities in terms of how governing bodies determine leadership pay ranges and where the ceilings of those ranges can sit. And again, similar flexibilities in terms of year on year deciding the pay framework for your leadership teachers and how that progression will actually work. Critically, for all teachers now, pay progression may be withheld where performance doesn't meet the expectations of your particular school. And that doesn't mean a teacher need be in formal capability process, but if you can demonstrate that a teacher has failed to meet your specific criteria, regardless of whether their performance is being managed formally, you have the potential to withhold pay progression.
Yeah.
And all those flexibilities should be captured in your written pay policy, which needs to be reviewed annually and should be a living, breathing document and a tool to help you and your staff meaningfully understand how pay is managed and how pay is determined. So I guess that's kind of the landscape in terms of where we are now.
Yeah, and clearly lots happened over the last few years in the world of teachers' pay and the relationship between, I suppose, sort of central government and mandated ways of working to the many discretions that schools have now to determine for themselves.
Absolutely, and I think as time has gone on, schools have become more comfortable with exercising those discretions and more familiar with the flexibilities they actually have.
Yeah.
So it's taken a period of 4 or 5 years, but we're really now seeing schools have the confidence really to use those flexibilities in a way that's right for them.
Absolutely. We've both worked with a number of schools, both sort of collectively and on an individual basis, wanting to review pay, review appraisal processes, and certainly with the budget position as it is, I think schools are all the more wanting to review what's right for them and ensure that fit for purpose is fit for their individual school and context and what they're wanting to do moving forward. So thinking about where we are now, let's just revisit the DfE's view, and certainly for them, I mean, this is a long-standing view, so schools absolutely free to adopt their own approaches to pay and appraisal, because no single approach, no national approach will suit all schools, and the recognition that it is about local context, local marketplaces, local issues in terms of recruitment and retention, etc. And so it's about schools being able to determine for themselves, and not intended that there will be uniformed uplifts for every teacher in every school. It is absolutely performance related progression. And recognition, and certainly within this session, obviously we talk about teachers' pay, and rightly so, the school teachers' pay terms and conditions document, but we also give a little time and space later in the session to talk about recognition in all its forms, not just pay, but also thinking about the importance of ensuring that you have other mechanisms for recognising and rewarding staff, and bringing that into the mix as well. So let's have a look then, understanding where we are now and the DfE's view. Let's have a look at the pay award for this year, and there's a little bit of a journey that the STPCD goes on towards becoming published, isn't there, Liz?
Yeah, and actually for this year, for the first time ever, Summer and I are not able at this point to confirm with you what the uplifts will be to teachers' salaries. We're in a kind of unprecedented position in that every other year, by the 1st of September, we've known for certain what the pay award or what pay increase was going to be imposed, and the STPCD, the pay conditions document, would usually have been published by this point. This year, it's all different, so really we are sharing with you today what we know, our best understanding of what has been proposed, but unfortunately we cannot confirm anything because we're waiting for national decisions. So in terms of what we know, the School Teachers Pay and Review Body report was published in July of this year. The report was quite bold in that it was advocating across the board a 3.5% uplift to each of the pay ranges for teachers. So the government looked at that recommendation, considered it for a period of time, and then came back and said that they intended to accept in part the recommendations of the review body report, but not in full, in that not all pay ranges will attract the 3.5% recommended pay uplift. And the next slide will show you in detail what actually has been proposed. So that government response was shared right at the end of July, and following that, the government entered into a period of consultation with stakeholders on the proposals and the proposed uplift. That consultation ended last week, so on the 3rd of September. So as of this point, we are hanging and waiting with eager anticipation to know what the outcome of that process will be. We hoped and prayed that we would have something confirmed to share with you today, but unfortunately that's not going to be the case. But I would imagine within the next week or so we are going to have to hear something formally, because schools need to know to be able to make their decisions. So in terms of what we're sharing now, it's our best understanding. So if we have a look at the next slide.
Yeah.
So in terms of uplifts, provisionally, the government has announced that it intends to award these uplifts from the 1st of September to each of the pay ranges. So if you can see on the slide there, for the main pay range, there's a proposal that the minimum value of the range and the maximum will increase by 3.5%. And then if you look at the upper pay range, that proposed increase is 2%. And then so on through the pay ranges, the leadership group range attracting the lower increase of 1.5%. And then you can see there's proposals also to increase the minimum and maximum values of the TLR and the SEN allowance by 2%. So these are provisional and proposed, but at this point nothing has been guaranteed. So you might want to use these as an indication of what that might mean, but I would really caution against making any firm pay decisions at this stage, because we just don't know what is going to be confirmed nationally. And I think the other important thing to note is that the recommendations only apply to the minimum and the maximum values of each of the pay ranges, so that floor and the ceiling value of each of the ranges. What you do as a school within those ranges is for you to determine and for you to decide, with reference to your pay policy and your approach, how you're going to apply any uplift to those teachers paid within the range.
Yeah. Okay. And as I say, if there are any sort of questions around this, please make use of the chat feature on the webinar toolbar. What we will do, given where we're at in terms of awaiting with bated breath further publication and release from the DFE, we will happily take those questions away and look to form an FAQ resource. We'll publish that certainly on our website, and we'll also send you guys a direct copy via email, having attended today's webinar. So we'll make sure that we make that available to you. So please do jot down your questions. We will respond to those. So those are the proposed percentage uplifts, and note Liz's comment about that's application to the minimum and maximum, and you have the ability to decide what you do within range. Thinking about funding considerations then, so the DFE, as part of their proposals, have talked about a new national pay grant that would look to cover the difference between the pay award and 1% award to schools as part of that, and they're looking at making that funding available 2018-19 and next academic year 2019-20 as well. What that funding looks like, we don't as yet know. We're hoping that further releases and publications will make that clear. Certainly what we do know is that the funding is specific to cover that difference between the pay award and the 1% award that you as schools would have no doubt anticipated anyway. The funding is time limited to the next 2 years, and certainly it would do well to consider the longer term implications. So be thinking about your 3-5 year financial planning forecast, because what happens in 2021, you need to be able to, however the funding is constructed, you need to know that you can afford your pay bill come 2021 when the reins are handed back to you as schools, academies and settings. So do think through. Maintained schools and academies will be eligible to access the funds, so both schools and academies. As I say, we're awaiting further details on the formula that's going to be used to allocate funding, and no doubt the local authorities, whether that's Kent for the schools that we work with most locally to our offices, or those that are joining us further afield. If you're a maintained school, then of course look out for further local authority advice around any advice guidance that they give in terms of how you might wish or be directed to approach pay, and certainly any advice and guidance specific to funding arrangements as the detail unfolds.
Our understanding at this stage is that additional funding will be brokered through, in the case of maintained schools, brokered through the local authority, so obviously they will be sharing advice with schools about the mechanics around that.
Yeah.
But as Summer rightly said, the detail of how that formula will be worked out has not been shared nationally. So although the DFE have said the award will be fully funded, what that fully funding will actually look like at this stage we can't say.
Yeah.
So it's about kind of approaching that with a word of caution until you actually see in pounds and pence what it is you're going to receive from that national grant.
Yeah, and certainly I maintain whether it's fully funded or part thereof, it is the thinking about sort of the longevity of your pay policy, and also your budget in terms of what happens in 2021 when that funding, as we understand it at this point, would be removed, and you're then picking up the pay bill in full. So needing to think very much in line with your future financial planning.
And of course you don't want to be in a challenge position in that you've had a cushion of financial support and that's suddenly withdrawn, and then suddenly you have to meet that higher than perhaps anticipated pay bill going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly whether it's us as schools personnel service or relevant sort of financial experts, certainly for those schools that are local to us here in Kent, their schools financial services who will no doubt be able to support in terms of financial modelling and supporting with that level of forecasting. So do make use of the supports and experts that you have around you. Do look to do that. So funding information, we'll share more of that as we can. Okay. So what does this mean for your schools? So as ever, and as we've talked about already, schools should need to determine how to apply any uplift or the uplift in accordance with the principles set out in your current pay policy. There are a range of approaches and that you can adopt, and certainly we identified 5 within our model pay policy that was released last year. A number of schools continue to use reference points. We are, as we've already mentioned, seeing an increase in schools wanting to exercise those flexibilities that are available as part of Teachers' Pay Terms and Conditions document and operate alternative models for pay. Whichever model you're using at the moment, you need to apply the provisions as set out in the School Teachers' Pay Terms and Conditions document to your model, so uplifting the minimum and maximum values of each range as per the confirmed percentage increases, and then if you're using reference points, decide on what you do within range. If you're using alternative models, decide on what that means for those alternative models that you're using. So making sure that you have that review. And of course, we're talking about 2018-19 as is appropriate given the pay terms and conditions document, but of course keep your approach to pay under sort of long-term review, and it might be that you're needing to change the way you either structure your pay or administer the process. And certainly pay is inextricably linked with the process of appraisal, and wanting to make sure that not only your pay policy is fit for purpose, but its administration and the appraisal process is equally fit for purpose and robust, and supports you to recognise and reward staff appropriately, supports you in your drive towards school improvement and the goals of your school and organisation if you're part of a larger trust, and making sure that everything is working for you as it should.
Okay, so in terms of thinking in a little more detail about what these changes might mean for your school, there's a couple of kind of provisos you need to bear in mind within the flexibilities that you do have to determine pay. So when we have the new minimum values published for each of the pay ranges, you as a school would need to ensure that any teacher who's currently paid the minimum value of any range would move to the new minimum value. You'll be aware that the School Teachers' Pay and Conditions document is actually a statutory document, so if you were to pay anyone beneath that minimum, technically that would be a breach of a statutory provision. So you need to ensure, regardless of performance, that anyone paid the current minimum would move to the new minimum value. So in terms of those teachers who are currently paid at the maximum range, it may be appropriate for them to move to the new ceiling value, and you should allow for scope for the individuals to move to that new maximum, but they should only progress if evidence of performance warrants. So if someone's on the current ceiling value but not performing at the level to expect for a pay promotion, there's no automatic requirement for them to move to the new maximum value. It's very much dependent on evidence of performance and meeting the criteria for that pay promotion in your school. And then, as we've already said, for those teachers that are paid within the range, you as a school have flexibility to determine locally to those middle teachers in accordance with the pay policy and the principles you've set out in your pay policy, and also critically with reference to the individual's own evidence of performance. And that's where the variations come in terms of your flexibility. In terms of the allowances, so the TLR and the SEN values, again, any teacher who's currently paid the minimum value of their respective TLR or SEN should move to the new minimum value. But then as a school, it's for you to determine what further increase is applied to anyone who's paid above that minimum. So you may want to increase the value of your TLRs and SEN in line with increases to your the main or the upper pay range. But that's for you as a school to determine locally. So I guess they're the kind of provisos around sort of the flexibility around minimums and maximums.
Okay. So, some scenarios.
Yeah, so just a little bit more on the process of determining pay progression for this year. I guess we've got 3 kind of points really that we wanted to walk you through. The first is in relation to affordability considerations. So Summer and I, over the past year, have delivered a number of workshops to schools, and we're very, very mindful of the affordability issues that you are all facing and the reality of the budget provisions or the budget situation that you're up against. So even with the additional pay grant, financially things are still going to be challenging for schools. So what we've been discussing with schools over the past year is the importance of identifying a whole school pay progression pot. So setting out at the start of each financial year how much money you have in the pot for pay and how much additional money you have in your budget pot for pay progression. I think that's kind of a key starting point before you then decide how you're going to cut that pot up. We've also been talking a lot over the past year with schools about the importance of pay modelling and looking at the implications in terms of pay decisions, not just for year 1, year 2, but over the longer term, 3, 4, 5 years, forecasting carefully, as best you can, what those pay decisions you make today will mean for the future and mean for your budget. And actually Schools Financial Services have a modelling tool that schools can access to help them with that longer term modelling and planning. But we can't underestimate the importance of that kind of careful financial overview of what you're doing in terms of pay.
Yeah.
So alongside affordability, the next kind of point we wanted to touch on was the pay policy aspect. So what is your school's approach to pay? Are you clear currently what's in your pay policy, how you approach pay, what framework you use, and how will you determine this year what uplift is applied locally to those teachers that are paid within your range? The pay policy should be a living, breathing and evolving document. So alongside determining exactly what the pay progression values are going to be this year, you might want to take this opportunity to have a look at the criteria that you set for pay progression and the evidence that you require staff to demonstrate of good performance to make sure that that policy remains fit for purpose. So once there's been that kind of review and look at the policy and how you're going to apply the increase, it's important that you get your governing body on board with any decisions you're making, because ultimately your pay policy, as with all your HR policies, are policies of the governing body. So governing body being on board with any changes you're going to make, and then we'd always advise local consultation on any changes to your pay policy. So although we consult county-wide on the document, it's for schools to determine locally pay uplift, and therefore it's appropriate that they would consult locally on any changes they're making to the pay policy year on year.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's have a look then at end of year reviews.
Yes, so in terms of end of year reviews, I guess that's the third aspect we wanted to kind of walk you through this afternoon. So as you might be familiar with, for teachers you need to ensure you complete their end of year appraisals by the 31st of October. And then for leadership teacher and head teacher, that deadline is extended to the 31st of December. So at this point in the year, you'd be planning in those review meetings, looking at the evidence, and then making pay determinations. So in terms of good performance, as we've already touched upon, that's really for the school to determine what criteria they set for pay progression. But as a general rule of thumb, we suggest schools look at 3 areas. Has the teacher met their appraisal objectives? Are they meeting the teaching standards? And what's the overall quality of their teaching and learning? So that kind of 3-pronged approach, we find in most cases give you a fairly good assessment of how the teacher is performing. But of course it would be for you within your pay policy to really refine and develop what those criteria were. Once you've completed the end of year appraisals, you then need to ensure there's a written pay recommendation and that a pay decision is made. Depending on the delegation arrangements in your school and as set out in your pay policy, it may be that you have pay decisions being made by your governors or a panel of your governing body or by the head teacher. But it's for you to go back and check within your pay policy how that delegation has been worked. Just want to touch on the use of moderation, because again that's something we've discussed quite a lot with schools in the workshops this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And wanting to ensure that there is fairness and parity within the process. So we talk to schools a lot about this area. There are 2 approaches to moderation, and you can have an absolute approach where your appraisers will make their respective pay recommendations, and you review those and and look to honour those recommendations in full, albeit keeping them under review and ensuring that you are confident in that. Their decision making. There's also a relative approach where in essence you are moderating each of the pay recommendations in relation to each other. So what you're wanting to do is ensure that there is parity across the school. So a recommendation for pay progression in one corner of the school has the same weight and feel and value of evidence as a recommendation in another corner of the school, be it key stage, be it year group, etc. And wanting to make sure that there is parity in that decision making. And so you're reviewing peers relative to each other. Particularly that's important when you're looking at support staff pay, and certainly if you are rewarding and recognising varying levels of performance, wanting to make sure that you've got those variables right, but across the piece wanting to make sure that you're quality assuring those pay recommendations so that you know that you're making right and fair and informed pay decisions, or you're confirming right and fair pay decisions.
I think when moderation has been used by schools, it's given them the confidence that their pay decisions are fair and equitable, and that you're rewarding parity of outcome in terms of achieving the performance levels with parity of reward. And certainly it goes to counter if you should get an appeal, you can demonstrate there's a robust moderation process in place. And then finally, everything you do in terms of pay should be underpinned by sort of fairness and equality considerations. Pay should be an objective, transparent process that starts in your policy in terms of setting clear criteria for pay progression, and should follow all the way through the appraisal process and review process, so staff have confidence that the pay decision outcome at the end is based on evidence and is underpinned by fairness and equality.
Absolutely. So that's talking about the end of year review. Let's talk about the local authority view and the union view now. So the LA view first. So maintained schools are advised to consider any local authority advice on the implementation of pay increases at a county level, and of course await guidance around the allocation of funding from the national grant. So do bear in mind the any LA perspective around approaches to pay, and obviously give that its right and proper consideration and follow relevant stipulations and guidelines there. In terms of the union view, it's highly likely that the unions will continue to advocate for the continued use of a reference point approach in preference to the many options that are open to schools and academies. So we are quite open to that being their position. Local authorities will continue have continued dialogue with unions at that county level. But as Liz has already mentioned, the importance of ensuring that there's local consultation on changes to your pay policy.
And also bearing in mind that the union view is a view.
Yeah.
But it's not the only view, and the DFE has been very clear about the ability for schools to exercise flexibility and determine an approach to pay that's right for them. And for schools, it's absolutely appropriate for you to go through that process and have a look at what approach to pay is right for you, and then year on year determine what uplift you are going to apply in line with local circumstances, budget position. So yeah, unions will come in with a strong view.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's the only view.
Absolutely, we're open and we recognise that that's going to be their position, and that's the value of our model pay policy. We're not advocating any one option. It is wholly right and proper that you as schools decide on what is the right mechanism for you for rewarding and recognising your staff, and we maintain that view.
Just in terms to revisit the local authority view, as yet the local authority haven't issued any guidance to schools for this year because they're very much waiting upon confirmation of the school teachers pay and conditions document and confirmation of the award. But once that has been determined, then there will be advice to schools, which obviously we will share with you and will be available by Kelsey and other local authority communication channels. And certainly for maintained schools, we strongly advise you to have an eye to that.
Yeah.
And particularly given the national grant situation, it's likely that the local authority advice will touch both on the funding mechanism and also kind of their kind of preferred approach in terms of pay.
Absolutely. So let's now talk about what changes do you need to make to your pay policy, because there's going to be some key actions for you to undertake. So governors, alongside the senior leadership team, you'll need to review your pay policy. It's part of your annual policy review cycle, not least because the pay terms and conditions document is updated annually, so you'll be familiar with reviewing your pay policy at this time of year. Ensure that your pay framework reflects the new monetary values, and also ensure that the evidence and criteria that you use to make your pay decisions are fit for purpose and absolutely meet the needs of the school. That's really, really important. And you'll need to ensure that you're consulting with employees and trade union representatives on any new policy. Well, there will be a new policy because you'll be uplifting the values at the very least. So absolutely consulting on that new policy, particularly if you're making more significant changes to the current workings of the current policy.
Yeah, so if for the next pay cycle, not for the pay decisions you're making now, but if for the next pay cycle you're looking at moving to a very different approach in terms of your pay policy, then that would be absolutely critical to have that level of consultation. Our consultancy colleagues can advise schools on the appropriate level and nature of consultation to engage in, but the important point to take away is that as a school, because of the discretions we have locally, it's incumbent on you to consult locally on your policy.
Yeah. And as Liz says, we can support with that if needed. Okay, let's look now then at some scenarios. I mentioned these earlier, but they in fact come up now. Let's look at how we can approach some specific situations that may well crop up during the course of an appraisal cycle. We've got a couple on screen there that are about absence during a cycle. So let's look at maternity and adoption leave and sickness absence.
Yeah, so I guess these exceptions to the process can throw up queries and they can be quite challenging for schools to manage. So we've just kind of captured on a few slides some of the key exceptions and how we would suggest you go about managing those. So in terms of maternity and adoption, withholding pay progression to a teacher purely because they're on maternity leave could be regarded as being discriminatory. The DfE in their guidance document implementing your school's approach to pay are very clear that when a teacher returns to work following a period of maternity or adoption leave, they should have received the pay increase that they would be due had they not had that period out on leave. That's a very clear message that purely that family-related leave should in itself and of itself be a reason for withholding pay progression. But clearly, where someone's going to be out of the workforce for a period of time, that may have implications in terms of how you actually manage and adjust the pay and the appraisal process for that individual during that year. So in terms of the adjustments, it wouldn't be unusual for a school maybe to review in the year that they knew a lady was going to go off on maternity leave, review the appraisal targets to make sure they were reasonable and proportionate for the individual to achieve in the period at which they were going to be at work. Likewise, you might be looking at reviewing the timing of any target setting meetings or end of year review meetings to accommodate the fact the individual's out on maternity leave. Critically, pay decisions should be made following the end of year review discussion. So if someone's off work and unable to have that review discussion, what you'd be wanting to do is have that review, end of year review, once they come back to work, and then backdate any pay award to the 1st of September. I think what we've learned by working with schools is how important it is for schools to discuss with their ladies or gentlemen, in case of adoption leave, how they intend to manage that period in terms of the appraisal and the pay process, so there's no surprises, so an individual knows that they may be having their meeting earlier or later, or there might be some other adjustments to the process, so there's absolute clarity of approach. And of course, as always, we're happy to walk you through any particular scenarios, particularly if you're in a position where you may be looking at withholding pay progression because you feel as a school, regardless of the fact the individual's been out on maternity leave, their performance before and after their period away from the workplace wasn't meeting the performance expectations in your school. And if that's the case, it's perfectly possible to withhold pay progression, but it's just about walking that through and having a discussion to make sure the decisions you're making are fair and non-discriminatory.
Yeah.
The other thing you may be looking at where someone has been out of the workforce or workplace on leave for the entire appraisal cycle is drawing on evidence from previous appraisal cycles. So you might look at evidence from the past 2 years to help inform pay decisions. Yeah, that's an option and a variation to the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and actually bringing together all of those options, if you have decided on objectives for proactively identified the maternity leave and realigned the objectives to make them aspirational but manageable within the period that they're going to be at work, and albeit it's a shorter appraisal cycle for them, you can look back to those past cycles and make an informed view that if the performance continued at this level, that they would be receiving pay progression and take that sort of view. But you need to ensure you've got sufficient records to support that.
Yeah. And I guess it's about going through that process in all other circumstances. Had the period of maternity leave not taken place or adoption leave, would you be in a position to give that individual pay progression and be comfortable in your own mind that there's sufficient evidence to warrant that progression?
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the case of sickness absence?
Yeah, so again, there is the potential to withhold pay progression if, due to the absence, there's insufficient evidence that the individual is meeting the performance expectations you have in the school. So it's not the fact that they've been off that would dictate withholding pay progression, but it's about the lack of evidence that they're working at a level that meets your performance expectations. The only caveat around that is in relation to an absence that might be disability related, and of course we'll be aware that that can sometimes be a bit of a grey area, but if there is an element of the absence that's related to disability, potentially to withhold pay progression, purely because of that could again be discriminatory along the lines of the considerations around maternity leave, so that kind of protection. And again, we'd encourage you to have conversations with us about circumstances where absence and particularly disability was a factor in withholding pay progression.
Absolutely, we're always here and happy to help to deal with these issues, some of which can be complex. So again, call on the support services that you have available to you. So that's maternity and adoption, as well as sickness absence. Let's look at training teachers joining midway through the cycle and those that are in their NQT year, and there's a few considerations here, isn't there?
Yeah, because of course not every teacher will join your school in September and be working through a complete appraisal cycle. So where a teacher joins you midway, they would be entitled to a pay review if they had accrued service in 26 weeks of the preceding school year. It doesn't have to be 26 complete weeks, it could just be 1 day a week service. It doesn't have to be continuous service, but if over that preceding year they taught at least one session for 26 weeks, they would be entitled to a pay review. So if they joined you midway through the last cycle and you're now looking at reviewing the performance and making a pay decision, it might be useful to reflect on the targets that you set them when they joined with you. Were they sufficiently achievable and proportionate to the period that they were with you in the school? We would certainly suggest where someone joins midway to make sure you're setting realistic short-term targets that maybe differ slightly from the targets you'd expect someone with you for the whole cycle. So if someone's made good progress towards their targets, you may be in a position to award them kind of full pay progression. But if your policy allows, you might be looking at partial pay progression to recognise that they've made some progress but not quite achieved everything you might have expected in their time with you. The thing to point out is there's no obligation to consider evidence from employment elsewhere. So it's not a case that a teacher rolls up with a portfolio of evidence from their previous school and expects you to consider that. What you're assessing is the individual's performance with you against their appraisal targets and against your performance expectations in your school. You're not expected to consider evidence from elsewhere. And then in terms of NQTs, newly qualified teachers, there's no automatic entitlement when someone completes their NQT year for them to get pay progression. I think that's a common misconception that's out there, but that's not actually the case. However, if they have been with you for 26 weeks, accrued 26 weeks of teaching service at the 1st of September, they are eligible for a pay review. You can use the evidence from their induction year to help inform those pay decisions, and if you feel that they're meeting the performance expectations that you would have of a main pay range teacher, it's absolutely appropriate for them to get pay progression. But that pay progression isn't dependent on them completing the NQT year, it's about the evidence of the performance and their level of performance during the cycle.
Yeah, which is actually really positive for the teachers, isn't it? We've had a very quick question around absence. And wanting to make the distinction between absence provisions in terms of the appraisal process for support staff and for teachers. Those of you that are from Kent-based schools, you'll be familiar with the Kent scheme arrangements, and there is a minimum period of service, working service, that somebody needs to achieve in order to be considered for a appraisal pay review. It's what we refer to as 9 months of aggregated service. So having spent 9 months, including closure periods, because we understand the weird, wonderful nature of school life, but 9 months of working time within school. For teachers,
Yes, there's no equivalent provision for teachers within their terms and conditions or within the school teachers' pay and conditions document. If a school wanted to adopt that approach, that would be something they could incorporate for teachers within their pay policy. We, in our model document, have kept it quite broad in terms of consideration around maternity, because we didn't want to box schools in terms of their approach. But if that 9-month aggregated approach you feel is something right and appropriate for you to work with your teachers, then absolutely you can look at incorporating that within your pay policy. But it's about being clear and upfront with individuals that that is your approach, because it's not something that's part of teachers' terms.
There you go. Okay, just thought I'd pick up on that one, having just talked about absence. Do keep your questions coming in, and we will in any case, as I say, be putting together that FAQ resource and publish that for you. So, a couple more scenarios now. So, a teacher that's employed at more than one school, and let's also talk about part-time, temporary and supply staff, because that's another important group.
Yeah, so often we see teachers working across more than one school. They might have a part-time contract in one school, a supply contract in another. In terms of teachers' pay and pay progression and the appraisal process, those employments are entirely separate, and each school, so each employer, should be following their own appraisal process and make their own pay decisions in their own school. So one school won't be tied or bound by the decision of another school in any way with regards to pay. So that might mean that it's completely possible for a teacher to be paid different rates of pay, or even on different pay scales between two different schools, because each employment is entirely separate. The other consideration in relation to that is that if a teacher passes the threshold, so moves from the main to the upper pay range in one school, that doesn't tie any other schools that they work in to also move the teacher up to the upper pay range. So those threshold decisions are entirely separate and independent of each other. And then in terms of part-time, temporary and supply staff, if someone, the important thing to remember here is part-time and temporary workers should have the same opportunity to receive pay progression and to engage in the appraisal process as full-time or permanent members of staff. So where an individual has 26 weeks teaching service, again, it needn't be complete weeks, it could be partial weeks, but where an individual has 26 weeks teaching service, they would be entitled to a pay review. And if their contract runs for more than a term, they should pick up and join the appraisal process. And you would need to make sure you're setting targets proportionate to the time that they're with you in the school or their contracted hours of work, and then undertaking that review if they have the 26 weeks service by the 1st of September.
Absolutely. So hopefully another couple of really useful, practical examples and scenarios there worked through, so that you can consider how to apply how to flex the appraisal process appropriately to manage those circumstances. Let's also have a look then at threshold, particularly the criteria. We've spent a lot of time with schools discussing this very issue and the importance of robust criteria, and also life post threshold.
Yeah, so given that a teacher can apply for threshold at any point in their career, it's really important that you as a school have defined and refined the criteria that you expect to see in a teacher progressing from main pay range to upper pay range. So a teacher can apply annually if they want. Applications should be made by the 31st of October, and they will be drawing on in their application primarily evidence from their appraisal, but you as a school might want to specify an application process or a pro forma for the individual to complete, demonstrating how they meet the threshold criteria. Whatever your mechanics of assessing that application is, we can't underestimate the importance of considering very carefully the criteria. If you look at the School Teachers Pay and Conditions document, it sets very broad criteria for pay for threshold progression, talking about a teacher being highly competent in the professional standards and making a substantial and sustained contribution to the school. and they are very broad, very vague criteria. What we would encourage you as a school to do is really drill down and explore what that means in your school, in your setting, and to document that in your pay policy. And in fact, in our model pay policy, we have example pay progression criteria for all the pay ranges, but we spent some time looking at those threshold criteria, really to make sure that they are robust and challenging, and that it isn't an automatic given that every teacher will move from main to upper pay range. It's right if they're meeting those performance criteria that they do, but it shouldn't be an automatic process. It should be a hurdle where someone needs to demonstrate they really are working at that level.
Absolutely. And it needs to be clear, coherent and transparent process, and there needs to be with that sort of a common language and fluency, so staff understand, appraisers understand, and we can all be discussing and understanding the criteria from a common place.
Yes, because substantial and sustained in one school might look very different to another school, and that's right, because you should have the ability to adopt criteria that are appropriate for your school. But it's about doing that legwork in terms of defining what that looks like in your setting and ensuring everyone's on board with that. The individuals, leadership team, appraisers, governors as well, because if you get to pay appeal stage and you haven't clearly defined what you're expecting, that again is kind of a potential area for difficulty. So it's about everyone being on board with what the criteria are for pay progression for whatever pay range.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, let's have a look now then, having talked about threshold, let's give a little bit of time to those instances, they do happen, hopefully few and far between, but those instances where we might be in a position of needing to decline pay progression, and it's really important that this is just as robust as any other part of the process, isn't it, Liz?
Yeah. So as we said at the outset, pay progression can be declined even where a teacher isn't in a formal capability process. But any decision to withhold pay progression should really be based on the principle of no surprises, in that during the year, through your mid-year review meetings with the individual, it should be flagged up that they are not on track to achieve pay progression, that their performance is falling short. So at the end of the year, it doesn't come as a huge surprise to the individual. And obviously you'd want to, during the year, be giving the opportunity, or the individual the opportunity, to address those areas of performance, putting in maybe extra support or training to enable the individual to succeed and make those pay progression criteria. I think where, in all instances, it's really important that your appraisal and pay documentation is full and robust, but particularly in instances where ultimately you may be looking at declining pay progression, it's really important then to have been able to demonstrate the evidence on which you've made that decision, to be able to objectively justify why it is you're withholding pay progression. And if you do get to that point where pay progression is declined, you would expect, or the individual would expect to see in writing an indication of why it was that decision had been taken, with reference to the reasons that they haven't met the performance criteria for pay progression. If an individual doesn't progress, they do have the formal opportunity to appeal that decision to the governing body. But prior to that, we allow for an informal discussion stage, so an opportunity for the individual to speak with the appraiser, or the person who made the pay recommendation, or the person who made the pay decision, really to understand why it was that decision was made and explore in a bit more detail the reasons behind the no progression decision. And what we have found on occasion is those kind of informal opportunities to discuss the reasoning has prevented the need for a formal appeal, because the individual accepts and understands the reason the decision was made.
Yeah, absolutely. So useful thoughts for you there as well. Equally, I think something useful for you to think about is, we've talked obviously a lot about pay, but as we mentioned at the outset, pay is one part of a policy and approach to reward and recognition. It's important to think about your full employee value proposition, as we call it. So your approach to pay is only one part of that value proposition, and an EVP encompasses all those central reasons that people are proud and motivated to work in your schools, academies and settings, and it'll include things like your vision and values, your workplace benefits, so thinking about your approach to flexible working. It'll include your approach to CPD and career progression, work content and working environment, and certainly there's been lots of reports and work and surveys around workload management, about well-being, about those very real and important issues within schools, and it'll include much more besides. So I guess just a couple of key questions to sort of leave you with on this point at least. What's your employee value proposition, and how is this communicated to staff? Both substantive staff, existing staff, but also thinking about potential recruits as well, so in your recruitment, advertising and documentation. And I suppose critically, particularly as we await news of budget funding, but appreciating that budgets are always going to be challenging within this sector, in a climate of shared budget constraints, and by shared I mean everybody is in that same boat of budgets being ever tighter. In that climate, how does your employee value proposition stand out? So thinking about what is it that you offer to your staff that supports them, that enables them to work effectively, to be motivated, to be engaged and fulfilled within your school and setting. So really think about what that is. Engage your staff. What is it that they value? Understand what that looks like. Build on it where you can. Capitalise on it where you can, and communicate it absolutely to existing staff and to new recruits. And also note that it might look slightly differently for different groups of staff. So what's the value to new starters, to your NQTs and those in their first year of teaching, might look quite different to those as they move through your school and gain an experience, and could look different again to those who are within leadership positions. So I really think the value of exploring that further, and certainly there is a wealth of research. I've done some research myself locally, and we'd be happy to talk with schools who want to look at this in more detail. Considering a new approach to pay then, so just a nod to a couple of sessions that we've been delivering to schools, supporting schools to think about these important issues. And as I say, pay and appraisal absolutely go hand in hand. So in terms of wanting to think about the characteristics of an effective appraisal process, really wanting to make sure that it's meaningful, that there's effective moderation, and of course that it's fit for purpose. So the sorts of things that we'll look at is exploring those characteristics. We'll look at systems and structures, we'll look at the administration of the process, and critically how you can evaluate the appraisal process and make sure that it is working for the organisation. We look at the importance of meaningful and robust criteria for pay progression, and how schools can ensure that those are robust and meet your purposes. We'll think about the staffing issues that can impact the process and how best to manage those. And all of this is encapsulated with an eye and a view to supporting you in delivering on your school improvement priorities. Equally, succession planning, and also thinking about that bigger piece of work around employee engagement as well. So if you're interested, details online to find out a little bit more about that session, and join a number of schools who have wanted to explore those issues. In terms of the pay policy workshop, we'll look at the alternative approaches to teachers' pay progression in more detail, giving you the opportunity to think about the pros and cons of each approach as they relate to the context that you find yourselves in within your particular school, and the sort of push and pull factors that you're experiencing. And we'll also be looking at guidance on implementing changes to your approach to pay. So we've talked about the importance of consultation. We have the opportunity to talk in more detail and give more ready advice, guidance and strategies for how you can approach that. But again, more details available online, and that might be something that you want to look at. So, actions for schools then, and a nod to the webinar toolbar and some material that we've made available for you to look at.
Yes, so to help you with navigating kind of the pay actions this year, we've put together a checklist document, and that's available in the materials section of the webinar toolbar, and that'll guide you through step by step what you'll need to do once the pay position has been confirmed and the SDPCD has been published. But in terms of actions, we've kind of highlighted key points there on the screen for you. So even though we're waiting final confirmation of pay decisions, you're still able as a school to continue with the end of year reviews, completing the end of year appraisals and pay reviews for all the eligible teachers in your school. You want to begin to carefully consider any financial implications in terms of pay, and obviously you'll be able to do that more fully once we have the confirmed pay figures and also details about that national grant. You'll need to be reviewing your pay policy and pay framework to reflect the new provisions within the SDPCD in terms of minimum and maximum salaries, and then be determining how much to award this year in pay progression for those teachers paid within the range, within those pay ranges within your school, but with reference to whatever framework you've set out in your current pay policy. Once you've made those decisions, every teacher is entitled to a pay statement which details how their salary has been broken down and will be paid for the next year. And then if you buy services from us, so our operational team and our payroll team, you'll want to be advising in due course any new salaries from September. And I believe that schools have already had the salary assessment spreadsheets in anticipation of the pay decision, but obviously we would advise you not to make any decisions or return those documentations until the exact uplift is confirmed. As always, seek advice from SPS about any specific circumstances, any exceptions relating to absence, any issues where you think there might be a challenge. And in the case of maintained schools, keep an eye out for that local authority advice, which will be coming once the uplift has been confirmed. And then, as Summer alluded to, thinking further forward, not for this pay cycle but for the next one, it might be an opportunity for you to consider a wider pay policy review, and the workshop that Summer just gave you an overview of is a perfect opportunity to start that conversation in your school about maybe moving to a different approach to pay. So they're all actions maybe for you to consider over the next couple of weeks as we await the confirmation of the award.
Absolutely, and just noticing the time, some additional information there, so that will be the link when the document is finally published. Long-standing guidance from DfE on implementing your school's approach to pay, so do have a look at that. We've obviously got model pay policy and related guidance. We'll publish salary scales, we'll have our checklist on there, although you can see it in the webinar toolbar, and we'll have those published FAQs. So as ever, keep a ready view on our website likewise. Just a quick note on some future webinars, if you're able to stay with me for just a moment longer. At the end of this month, so actually it's 2 for 1 in September in terms of webinars, Friday the 28th of September, we've got a really special event. We're partnering with Macmillan Cancer Support, national charity, and we'll be co-delivering a webinar on managing cancer in the workplace, so get online and register for that. time to coincide with the coffee morning. In October, we'll have the usual employment law update with our partners at Invicta Law. November, the LADO is going to join us to take a look at the LADO role and their work and explore that a little bit more. And in December, we'll be looking at promoting and supporting wellbeing in the workplace. And we'll also take a quick glance at what's coming in 2019 as well, wanting always to keep an eye on the future. Training, you'll have access to our brochure and flyer there. All the details are online in the usual place. Check that out and join us for any and all events that are helpful to you and your school. We've overrun by a couple of minutes, but thank you very much for staying with us. As ever, we hope that this is really useful, an important topic, and more information will be published and released in due course, and we'll look to keep right on top of that and share that as quickly as possible with you. You folks take care, have a great rest of your Wednesday and a great rest of your week. We're already a week down, folks.
Goodbye, everyone.
Take care, bye-bye.